Welcome to Where Parents Talk. My name is Lianne Castelino. Our guest today is an educator, a former classroom teacher, university professor, and special education director. Dr. Joe Lockavitch is also a school psychologist, applied reading researcher, author, and father of five. He is the president of Failure Free Reading, described as a groundbreaking reading approach. Dr. Lockavitch joins us today from Concord, North Carolina. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you. I can't tell you how excited I am to talk to you, Leanne, and to talk to your audience. I'm very, very much looking forward to this.
Well, and so am I, because we're talking about something that is pertinent to all of us. And in recent years, decades, certainly, it has gone fundamental changes. We're talking about reading and literacy. So, what concerns you most, Dr. Joe, as you look at where reading levels are today, generally, among young people, among students as a whole?
Well, what concerns me is a lot of times people don't realize the good news and the bad news. The good news is, contrary to a lot of public belief and what you hear in the journals, the kids that are reading successfully today are reading at a much higher standard than 20 years ago, and definitely 40 years ago. So a lot of times when we look at, quote, the crisis in reading, we don't put it in a proper perspective. What we really have is a dichotomy. And that dichotomy is we got a lot of kids who are doing really, really, really great things in the area of reading, far better than has ever been done before at their grade level and at that state in time. But we also have a significant number of students who are testing well below the 20th percentile. And as one superintendent said, he said, Dr. Joe, my issue is not with the kids that are below basic. He said, we have below basics where we're the one of the largest school districts in the nation. But he said, my real issue, and he said, we're touching the kids that are below basic. We're touching the kids that are close to proficiency. So I said, well, then what's your issue? He said, I'm concerned about the FBB. And I said, okay, I bite. What's FBB? And he said, far below basic. And that's where I come in, Leanne.
Let's talk about what are some of the contributing factors to kids in that category.
Yeah, in my book, which is I'm getting ready for a second edition, but the Failure-Free Methodology, New Hope for Non-Readers, I talk about the three characteristics of chronically struggling students. And for lack of a better term, I said that they were PD, ED, and LD. Now, PD in today's state and time is still the most controversial part of my program, and the one that gets me a lot of times into the biggest amount of hot water, because people don't understand where I'm coming from. And let me digress before I get to it, but I promise you I'll get to it. Leanne, reading is most research topic in all of education. Yet, if I were to take the 12, 14, 16 leading reading researchers, put them in one room with but one entrance in, one entrance out, put an armed guard at that door and told them that they couldn't come out until A, they had a definition of what reading is that they universally accepted, and B, how it should be taught, Leanne, they'd starve to death before they ever came out of the room. So to say that there's a broad range of opinion is an understatement. But if there is a universal fact that one can draw and that I operate on, it's all reading programs work, but they don't work for all students. And my argument has been The reason why is because it violates the principle of neurodiversity. I am a believer that we should spend less time on the remediation of a deficit and more time on the capitalization of strengths. Everybody comes into this world with strengths and weaknesses. And what we need to look at is if your child or if your student is failing, you have to ask what are the conditions in which they're failing? And if that's the case, what can we do to compensate in the sense of what can we do to circumvent it? What can we do to provide an alternative? How do we get past that? That was a long-winded explanation. I'll take a deep breath and see if you have any questions for me right now.
There's a lot to unpack in what you said, certainly, but let me just start by saying that in 2024, we have had the smartphone around now since 2007, so 17 years. And many
Yes.
parents with kids that have been, in that generation, will say that, you know what, they're just not reading as much. Their reading skills aren't where they need to be. The reading comprehension, we're all scanning and skimming, and I am
And texting.
concerned. And texting. What is your response to that, to parents, firstly?
Well, I think they're absolutely correct. And so I think the most important thing is as a parent. Now, by the way, I have five of my own. All of my kids went to Title I schools. They have all graduated from college. I'm a second generation American who was the first in my family to graduate from college. So education to me is extremely important. And I now have or getting ready for our 14th grandchild. And I've been blessed in the sense that all of them live within a 5-mile radius. So I'm still actively involved and I see what they have to go through. If there is an issue, or if there is one thing that a parent can do to enhance reading and to enhance their overall success in life, I'm going to give parents a one-word clue that you can start from. I started with my 5 kids from the womb and have never looked back. This one word will allow parents to know, in my opinion, what is the most successful and most important thing that they can do for their child. Would you say that it's worth it to listen to me run my mouth, so to speak?
Absolutely.
Okay. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
Vocabulary. Vocabulary, 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 vocabulary. Reading is a vehicle for gaining knowledge, but it's also a vehicle for developing vocabulary. If there is one thing that we as parents can do, it is we can set up an environment in which language is key, and that we set up conditions in which our kids are immersed in language, immersed in vocabulary, because we're a highly verbal society, Lianne. We're judged, sadly, the moment we open up our mouth. The more articulate we are, the more we're going to be able to succeed in life. And that's just a given. So reading is a vehicle for that. Now, so if you have kids who are spending a tremendous amount of time texting on the smartphone, doing that, not reading as much as we would like them to read, while we can't control that all the time, what we can control is the way in which we talk to them, the way in which we expand their vocabulary, the way in which we can give them the tools in which they can be successful as they head forth in life. Thoughts?
Let me pick up on that point. How would you suggest a parent help their child expand their vocabulary? And let's focus on kids, tweens, teens, that age group.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the first thing is that you can use books to enhance it. So they're not they're not opposed to each other. In fact, one enhances the other. So one of the things that you can do is to look at, number one, let's look at what they bring home. Forget what they do on their own. Let's look in terms of what they bring home and how we can expand that. We've got tweens who are in sixth grade, seventh grade, eighth grade. We're involved in a project right now in North Carolina, thanks to the North Carolina State Legislature, in which we are trying to accelerate the vocabulary of chronically struggling students in grades 6, 7, and 8, because we know that if you elevate their vocabulary, you're going to elevate their comprehension, you're going to elevate their performance. And when I do training, and talk with teachers, I always say you have to remember we're spending too much time treating symptom and not enough time treating disease. And they'll look at me and they'll say, what do you mean by that? And I say, poor reading, poor comprehension is only symptomatic of a greater disease. And that disease is language. So elevate their language and you'll elevate their performance. For example, and I'll give you a statistic that's kind of frightening, but researchers have found that highest performing third graders have a vocabulary superior to lowest performing 12th graders. Kind of amazing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So what can we do? Well, when I talk to teachers, I will state, after I say that, I'll say from this moment on, and I want you to remember this, you are a language teacher first, you are a reading teacher second, you are a content teacher third, and you can't change the order. To which someone will say, I'm a math teacher, I don't teach reading. To which I say, yes, you're a math teacher and you don't teach reading. But in order to understand math, you have to teach the language of math. You have to teach the terminology involved in math. So when you send a book home with the child, as a parent, when you receive it and you ask them to read out loud, you may find that there's terms in there they don't understand. And if they can't relate to it, then they're not going to be able to read it with my definition of reading, which is gaining meaning from the printed page. So one of the things that I suggest always as a parent is, if you can, one, look at what it is they're being asked to do. And then look in terms of what I call looking for the roadblocks to reading comprehension. Now, you're probably going to ask, roadblocks to reading comprehension? And if you did, which I know you do, that's a wonderful question, Lianne. What do I mean by roadblocks to reading comprehension? Well, what we found is when it comes to our kids, as Frida Ebert says in California, University of California, she said, text does matter in the teaching of reading. Text does matter in the teaching of reading. And not all text is comprehensible. And the reason why it isn't comprehensible is because there are actually roadblocks to reading comprehension that authors don't think of, and we as parents haven't been taught to look for, or teachers. So what are some of those roadblocks to comprehension? Well, the first is one that I just talked about: uncommon names, dates, places, and terms. If they can't relate to it, they can't read it. And what good is sounding it out if they don't know what it means? The second is abundant idiomatic expressions, figurative speech that are extremely confusing for many of our kids. And we live in a highly figurative language. And for some of the kids, expressions that we take for granted, our kids don't know. The best thing is read aloud and ask them, do you know what this means? You'd be surprised at they don't know it. Now, the next is the way in which it's written. Not all sentences are written in the most comprehensible format. Researchers have found that there are really four components to the most comprehensible sentence: simple, positive, active, declarative. Lianne, let me ask you a question. I'm going to read two sentences. out loud. I'll say them out loud, and then we'll look at it in terms of grammar. The man drove the car. The car was driven by the man. In terms of the meaning, just the meaning that is trying to be conveyed, is there any difference in meaning between the man drove the car and the car was driven by the man?
No.
No, identical. Which one will be read easier?
The man drove the car?
Absolutely. Why? Because it's a simple, positive, active, declarative sentence, same object, action, orientation. The man is driving a car. And the second one is a passive sentence. And all of a sudden, the car was driven by the man. So when you look at that, simply because the author chose to use a more awkward sentence structure, the deep meaning that they're trying to convey is being blocked or is confusing to a particular set of kids. So when you look at some of the literature, for example, that kids are being asked to, their English literature, you may find a sentence that is 24, 25, 30 words long with phrases and clauses. So it has to be translated. You translate it for them, then you can ask them to read it. And in many cases, I ask when we're getting to tweens and teens, I kind of ask that we use the book. We don't use the book to introduce. We use the book to reinforce something that we introduced prior to it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Thoughts?
Absolutely. So let me break that up a little bit and ask you
Sure.
for kids today, let's say again, tweens, teens, adolescents, who are living in the smartphone age, who are living in the age that we described earlier, who maybe don't have a reading level where it needs to be in order to survive and thrive as they get older into post-secondary, et cetera, et cetera. What would you say to a parent to help that child who's living in the world of texting and short forms and acronyms and every other thing, to help them get on the right path?
In a perfect world, put the smartphone away and let them know that we are going to reserve 30 minutes in which the two of us are going to sit down and I'm going to share my joy of reading as we read together. Now, we now know in my research and in the work that I'm doing in North Carolina, I have the students. They are working self-pacing for the most part, online software, in which they work 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, enhancing their vocabulary, reading passages. And we found that's for the lowest performing kids. We found kids in one particular school, kids who were testing on a standardized end of grade, North Carolina end of grade test. The year before, they tested on average at the 5th percentile, which means you can't get any lower than that. It means if you're testing at the 5th percentile, 95% of the kids are testing above. That on the basis of this truncated, intense 30 minutes a day session for 15, 20 to 30 days. This year, their average percentile ranking was in the mid-20s. That's pretty significant. That's almost a 400% increase. And when we ran statistics on it, it showed that it was statistically significant. So 30 minutes a day ain't bad. And it gives you an opportunity to spend time, quality time with your child. And there are still a lot of good books out there that, frankly, just reading it to them aloud and using it as a vehicle to explain, to discuss, to create terminology would go a long way. Is this helpful to you?
Yes, and let me ask you, the 30-minute a day approach, what age should it
Yes.
ideally start at? And is it always 30 minutes, regardless of age?
No,
Ideally.
it's not. It's not. I'm talking about a good medium. But if you can't, there's some situations. Let's start at 15 minutes of quality. Let's just let me read half a page or a page, and then let's just discuss it for a little while. Let's put the because some of the kids don't have that attention span right now. That's one of the things. That's why they like smartphones. That's why I like it. I mean, you don't have you're on TikTok, you're on anything. Look at Instagram, Shorts, YouTube Shorts. What are they? 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. So let's build on what they're used to. But hopefully, if we are going to get them excited, then maybe the next day it's going to be 16 minutes or 17 minutes and build our way up to 30 or 40 or even an hour. The point is to make it enjoyable and to let them know that this is our time. It's a quality time. Now,
I
that to
mean,
me go a long way.
yeah, absolutely. You developed the failure-free reading approach in 1988. What would
Yes,
you say? What would you say are some of the key differentiators of that approach? You alluded earlier to a strengths-based focus rather than a deficit-based focus, but what are some of the other key differentiators of failure-free reading?
What I found was failure free is a step one program. It's designed to jumpstart those kids with dead reading batteries, and to show them that they can do faster, they can do higher, and they can do more. Because right now, if they're struggling, for the most part, what they're getting is an RD intervention rather than a CS intervention. RD is that we're going to remediate the deficit. So what we're going to do is we're going to believe that if you're behind right now, then what we're going to do is we're going to give you slower, lower, and less. But you don't catch up with slower, lower, and less. A CS, which is what I base everything on, is capitalize on the strength. If kids are struggling, for example, with letters and letter sounds, and they don't have a good ear for sounds, um, there are viable site-based alternatives that will allow those kids to be successful. Because one of the things that we realized, by the way, the last and most important thing in that roadblock to reading comprehension, I totally forgot about, and that is repetition. What we found was this: Chuck Hargis, University of Tennessee, many years ago, once did a study in which he looked at, is there a variable? Is there a skill from a statistical standpoint that as the literacy level drops, the need for this skill proportionately increases? And he found there was almost a direct correlation. The lower the literacy level, the greater you need this. And you know what that skill was, Leanne? Repetition. Repetition. And right now, in many ways, repetition has become um, a negative word, because people who know how to read forget the importance of repetition. So when they're in something that's highly redundant, they're saying, "Oh my God, this is terrible. How many times are you going to say the same thing?" But when you're struggling, this amount of repetition isn't boring. It's the mother of learning if done properly. So one of the things that I found, and what I would do is I would go out across the country, and I would literally come and I'd say, I'd like to do a live demonstration, whether it was a middle school, a high school, a prison, a youth facility, an elementary school. I didn't care. It didn't make any difference. I was only coming on two conditions. The first condition is I only want to work with the kid they're having the greatest difficulty with. And the second condition is if you don't see dramatic change in their ability within a 30-minute period, I'm walking out the door. Now, I've given this 1,000 times across the nation, and ask me how many times I walked out the door. None. And the reason why is because I set the conditions that were allowing them to be successful. I took nothing for granted. I was predicated on a three-word philosophy, which is reading is relating. I made sure that the content that I was presenting in front of them was content that they could understand it. So I previewed the material. I introduced the vocabulary. I read that part of the story to them. I curbed the use of multiple meaning words, idiomatic expressions, figurative speech. I made sure that I used what was called spaced learning. So I started with simple active declarative sentences where I introduced the vocabulary, and then I introduced that into sentences, and the sentences into paragraphs, and what was on paragraph 1 led to paragraph 2, which then led to paragraph 3. It was highly structured. Once they understood what was expected in the first lesson, the next lesson, other than the content, was identical. And I worked with clients with IQs as low as 45, 50. And I couldn't have, I never met one that didn't have a successful reading experience when I controlled for those variables.
Dr. Joel, can you take us through some of the telltale signs briefly? Telltale signs that a child, an adolescent, a tween might be struggling with reading.
Well, number one, grades. You got D's, you've got F's, behaviors. One of the things that you got a lot of kids that now I know we're in the world of book packs, but before that, you used to have what I call the biggest book theory, and that was those were kids that were walking down in the hallway with the biggest book when they couldn't read it, but they didn't want anybody else to know that they couldn't read it. So this was their facade. A lot of times you'll see the kids overly aggressive, acting out, being thrown out of class because they learned, frankly, that it's a lot easier to go one-on-one with the assistant principal than it is making a fool out of yourself in front of peers. But let me also say that those are kids who are smart enough to realize how to get out of the class. Things like being told that they can't sustain, they can't work by themselves, they can't work for for short periods of times. Then I look at the tangibles are. Look at their writing samples. Can they write in sentences? Look at their spelling. Is their spelling bizarre? You can look at those performance situations and then listen to them. Are they, for some kids, because we're running a spectrum, some of our kids are socially naive. Some of our kids are, when you compare their vocabulary to the vocabulary of their peers, that's a whole different ballgame.
Quick tips for parents on how to foster a love of reading in children, and what ideally should that start at? What age?
Number one, demonstrate it. Demonstrate it yourself. I mean, well, how can you tell me to stop the smartphone while you got while your nose is in the smartphone? You have to set a time. You have to discuss it. You have to share with them your love of literature, and they're going to watch you. They're going to see what you do. Develop that vocabulary. That's wonderful. Set aside a reading time. Sit down with them, and if they look at their science, their social studies, their math. Ask the teacher, if you're talking tweens and teenagers, just ask, is there any way that I can have his assignments the week before so that I can sit down with him and go over them before he comes into class the next day. Listen to read a passage to them, and then ask them, do they know what this means?
Lots to think about, certainly lots of tips for parents. Dr. Joe Lockavitch, educator, president of Failure Free Reading. Thank you so much for your time and insight today.
Well, thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed it.